Hello, thank you for joining us for the Spring 2022 Division A newsletter edition of The Conversation. We have Julie Kasper and Jill Koyama here to help us think through refugee education at the leadership level. So Julie, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and then tell us a little bit about your background working with refugee students and families.
Thank you, Lindsay, for hosting this conversation today. I'm Julie Kasper. I'm a program manager with the Refugee Educator Academy in the Center for Learning and Practice at Childhood Education International. I identify first and foremost as a teacher. So my work with refugees began about 22 years ago now in the classrooms of Tucson, Arizona, where I was serving in a school that was sort of a refugee resettlement hub. So many families were being resettled into apartments in the neighborhood. And I began working with refugees as an experienced teacher, but not as a teacher who had worked with that particular population before. And it was a steep learning curve, still is. I would say I'm still very much learning how to do this work. I taught at that school for almost a decade, and then I left the school setting to work as our refugee school coordinator for the state of Arizona in Tucson. And in that role, I was developing programs with school districts and outside of school districts to better serve refugee students, better prepare their teachers for the work they were doing, and also support families in understanding the U.S. school system and ways to engage. So that was my first sort of outside of the classroom leadership role, I guess. And now the work that I do is with an international NGO working with teachers across the US and around the globe who are working in a variety of refugee education settings, including displacement settings, migration settings, and resettlement settings.
Hey, thank you, Julie. Thank you for being here. Jill.
Lindsay, thanks for inviting us. I'm very happy to be here. I'm Jill Koyama. I am currently professor and vice dean of the Division of Educational Leadership and Innovation at Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College, Arizona State University. I first, like Julie, I first began working with refugees several decades ago. So in the late 1990s, I worked at a community college in Seattle. And at that time, there were many Cambodian, Hmong, and Vietnamese refugees with whom I was fortunate to work. Then I went and got my doctorate, and my first job was at SUNY at Buffalo. And there, almost immediately, I volunteered to be an ESL tutor to adult refugees and started working with two of the refugee organizations there and continued that through my time there. And when I moved to Arizona in 2013 to go to the University of Arizona and work, one of the first people that I met was Julie. And so my work with refugees and research has continued steadily since 2009 and since 2013 in Arizona.
Thank you for being here, Jill. So moving on to the Q&A portion of this. In what ways does your current research inform the critical inclusivity of refugee students and families? Julie, did you want to jump in?
I was going to let Jill start. I think so many different ways. I'll start with some of our recent work around translanguaging and transworlding and really thinking about pedagogical choices and approaches, thinking about curricular materials and approaches, and thinking about what's happening day to day in the classroom in terms of the relationships and the exchange and the dialogue between learners with each other, with the materials that they're handed, with the materials that they bring, with their families, with their communities, with the digital space, and then with their teachers. And so what does that exchange look like, and what constraints are there on those relationships between those learners, refugee learners, and their teachers, and what are some of the possibilities in that? And so certainly looking at ideas of translanguaging and transworlding is very important in terms of thinking about how we lead in our schools for not only inclusion, but really a deeper sense of belonging and connection, I would say, and also for learning that happens in a variety of ways across a variety of spaces, both inside and outside of our schools.
Okay. So I think in all the work that I have done and research I have done, there's been a pretty consistent thread that runs through it, looking at how refugees and other migrants are positioned and how they position themselves. So to your question, Lindsay, I've looked at, Julie and I have looked at how our parents positioned and situated by schools and school boards and school adjacent organizations, and how are they excluded or sometimes less often so included in that. As Julie said, we've looked at how students use all their semiotic resources in pretty marginalized situations in schools. I have a current interest in writing about two other topics within refugee education. And one, I'm really concerned about deservedness and who deserves and who says they deserve what, and do some migrants deserve more than others by their legal status? And all we have to do is look at the current situation in Ukraine and the recent situation in Afghanistan to see that it's hierarchical, right? And within that work, I'm really thinking through where, if at all, do refugees fit in studies using critical race theory and racial discourses in schools. They often seem absent. So that's some of my current thinking.
Yeah, and just picking up on that, also thinking about teachers, many of whom in the US context anyway, are white, middle-class, monolingual women, often bilingual as well within certain spaces, but thinking about the positionalities of teachers like myself working with students who are speaking multiple languages, coming with multiple worldviews and deeply embedded in the hierarchies like Jill is referencing in terms of race, in terms of class, in terms of gender and sexuality. And thinking about, a lot of my work at the moment is thinking about how to better equip teachers to lead within their classrooms and within their schools for transformative change in those settings. Knowing that refugees are in many schools a very small subgroup, and in many districts a small subgroup that are not necessarily going to get the attention of district leaders or school leaders, although we hope that they will. We hope those of you listening in those roles are paying attention. But knowing that teachers who are interacting with the students and families day to day are in a position to really change some of the dynamics and address some of the inequities and systems of oppression under which they're working. But then what is it that teachers need to know and be able to do? What do they need to be thinking critically about and with in order to do that work? So that's some of my research at the moment as well. And I failed to mention earlier, I'm in a PhD program, just finishing coursework. So trying to form the research questions around that idea to move us forward in thinking about how we might lead and change educational opportunities and experiences for refugee youth.
Thank you, Julie. I look forward to reading your future outcomes about better equipping teachers for transformative change within the classrooms to support refugee students and families. But I want to go back to your current research that you both are working on a little bit. Could you tell me more about your work with parents and families and whether or not they're included or not included within the schools that you're researching with?
I can start. So I looked at several different school districts across two very different states, Arizona and New York. And for the most part, I would say that refugee parents were not involved in the kinds of very normative white middle-class ways that schools often expect parents to be involved. So going to PTA meetings, volunteering for school trips. And I would argue that those aren't the most meaningful source of engagement with parents, all parents. And so in one example, I was really happy to find that refugee parents were actually involved on certain boards and committees, and they had some decision-making power. And that was in part because that school district had a very strong multilingual learners department and also worked very closely with refugee resettlement organizations. So that was a really positive example. In the other studies, in other districts that I've seen, it's been less so. And so the refugee parents in some way are, of course, seen as the other. Their language is often not understood. Their role in their child's life is undervalued. But then I would also say that many refugee parents have expressed to me that they don't understand why principals and teachers are asking them their opinion. They were concerned that the schools might not be as good as they heard they were in the US, if in fact the schools were asking the parents for their advice. And so, very humble. So I heard that repeatedly as well.
Yeah, and just building on that a little bit, many parents that I've worked with and spoken with have wanted to be more involved in their children's education, but there are multiple barriers, as Jill noted, language. Some of the parents themselves didn't have the same sort of formal educational experiences, so perhaps they can't help with homework in the way that they know maybe is requested of them or required of them or expected of them, or even their child is asking of them. So there's those situations, and yet the parents really do want to know what the US school system is doing and how it works, and yet the opportunities for them to learn and engage with that are quite limited in what we have seen, and even reviewing the literature more broadly, there are just as you put it, Jill, really well, I think there are these normative expectations of how a parent engages with school. So a parent-teacher night is the way you do that, or a parent-teacher association is the way you do that, or setting up a meeting with the principal is the way you do that. But if none of those are familiar or welcoming or interesting spaces for you to engage, what are the alternatives, right? And unfortunately, our schools don't offer very many alternatives at this point. Some things that I've seen in the research, especially in relation to English learner families who are Spanish speaking, are like cafecitos and, more sort of family-oriented gatherings where people can come and talk and also get questions answered, and more informal. They can bring children, young children. Some of those experiences might be expanded to other language groups and other communities within the refugee education space, and may have some impact, and may not. I mean, that's just speculation, but just thinking through what we've heard from parents. One, why do I need to get involved? What is expected of me, and why don't the schools know what they're doing? Being the question that Jill raised earlier. But two, if there is an expectation for me to be involved, what does that really look like, and how do I fit into a system I don't understand very well? That said, I think that in some districts, there are parents who are involved in the schools and in leadership roles, as constrained as they may be, through translation and interpretation jobs, or through mentorship or community liaison positions. And I see that across the US in a number of settings, including in some of the settings where Jill and I have done some research and analysis. And so they bring their own personal family experience and questions and expertise to that role, but they also then become kind of a conduit for other families to connect with the schools and learn more about ways to get involved potentially. So I think I'll stop there and see if you have any follow-up question, or if there's anything you want to add, Jill.
No, I mean, I'm going to say no, and then I'm going to start adding things. Julie's used to that. I think one of the values that Julie and I share is having very learner-centered, very learning-centered context, and those aren't always in schools. So our work has always spanned schools to community organizations, to resettlement agencies, to government entities. And so in that way, we see multiple contexts with parents and families and refugees engaging with institutions and systems. And yeah, for the most part, like we're amazed and always in awe of what these families can do, and the way that they can negotiate really complex systems, and that they do it so well and consistently, and always, with their child's well-being at the center of it. And so I want to note that too, that while there are many seeming roadblocks and challenges, I don't see them give up, especially when it involves their children.
Yeah, and just to build on that, I don't see teachers who really want to get to know families and connect with families. I don't see them giving up either. So, the best exchanges I've had with families I've worked with are in their homes, and I've always been welcomed. And I think it's just really important to note that in many practices, many teachers' practices, many school practices, home visits are not a norm. In some cases, they're not even supported or welcomed by administrators or others who have concerns about that. But I think that it's a really important aspect of thinking about how parents are engaged and are involved, and the ways that they want to connect, and the fact that they do have an interest and do have a lot to share, and it may just be on different terms, right? So just to highlight that for people who are thinking about research, but also thinking about their leadership practice, and where are you expecting that to happen? Are you expecting it to happen in your time space, and everybody should accommodate themselves to your time space, or are you willing to engage in other times and spaces with folks as they wish?
Thank you. I think that takes us to our next question. So why is this a timely and crucial conversation for the field of educational leadership?
Right, so that there are greater than 80 million people displaced across the globe. Now, maybe 24 to 26 million of those are identified as refugees. With climate change, there's only going to be more. With the continued unrest and dwindling of democracy across the globe, there will be more refugees, more people in transit, as we're seeing. And so I think for ed leadership and for educational leaderships, it's always going to be timely, in part because we will continue to have these waves and these influxes, maybe, in some places quite small numbers, as Julie was saying. But what we know is that what works for culturally, linguistically, ethnically diverse students like refugees actually works for all students, right? So this idea that there needs to be a separate approach, while some things need to be unique from their histories and their cultures, what ed leaders can do for all students can incorporate what is also shown to be really good for refugees and other migrants. I also think as we continue to grapple with public education in the United States, and where we are losing ground in the public sphere in education in many states like ours, Arizona, we need to have education leaders in whatever capacity they're working, whether that's teachers, whether that's assistant principals or principals, recognize the importance of, inclusion, equity for all students, including refugee students.
Just building on that, we're really in this moment of everything being unsettled, as Jill was just saying, in terms of our educational realities. I think the pandemic shook everything up in ways that were really painful, and also I think created opportunities. So why this moment now? I think because we hopefully learned a lot through the challenges of the last couple of years, including how deeply ingrained the systems of inequity are in our educational systems. And hopefully we're looking to do differently and do better. And, unfortunately, I'm seeing a lot of schools and school systems return to what they were doing prior. It's exam season and everybody's rolling out their standardized assessments, which is not to say those have no place or no value, but given that we're restarting learning in these community spaces, is that where we really should be this spring? So just asking questions like this of this moment is really important. And then when we figure in refugee students, so students, let's think of the students who have just arrived from Afghanistan over the last few months and are just entering classrooms, and they're entering into standardized exams. I mean, is that really how we welcome students into our schools and our systems? Unfortunately, it has been for decades. You know, when I was working, I was often testing students when they arrived, not only for placement, but if they arrived in the spring, it was standardized testing, and that's where they went because there were no classes happening because we were testing, you know, and that's just absolutely horrifying. And so how can we think about things like the start of the school year and the fact that not all students are there on day one? And this is, as Jill said, this is not just for refugee students, but it's especially true for refugee and asylum seeking and migrant students who arrive all year. And yet many of our welcome and onboarding activities happen in August or September, and that's it. And so what does that welcoming and onboarding look like the rest of the year? And then also thinking about critical race theory and thinking about some of the really amazing work that's happening around disability studies, critical disability studies, and around LGBTQ inclusion, and thinking with and through all of those theoretical and practice spaces. How do we then attend to the diversity of refugee experiences that are entering our schools? And as you said, Jill, if we look to the most marginalized in our schools and we create curriculum and materials and practices that really embrace and welcome and support them and create positive and joyful learning experiences for them, we know that's going to be good for the entire school. And so for me, working in refugee education is really about thinking about these students who are so outside of the system in so many ways. And if we can figure out how to reshape our system, not to bring them into the system and make them adapt to everything that we're asking of them, but rather to reshape our system so that they're not so outside and not so marginal in that system, perhaps we can really get at some of this change that we've talked about through this pandemic that we really say we want and we know we need. Perhaps this is that moment if we pay attention to those who are most marginalized. And we can think through all of the intersections there. We don't need to unpack all of that in this conversation, but each individual person listening can think through what are all of those categories and intersectional identities that are marginalizing students in our schools, and then who would we place as the most marginalized, and then look at our policy and practice and how are we best addressing and meeting their needs and building on their talents and their aspirations. Yeah. I think that's why it matters right now. It matters right now for so many reasons. And just also to note that because we're working with transnational people, and that we'll be doing that forever. We have been, we just didn't always pay attention, and we will be, given what you noted, Jill, about the climate crisis and the movements that that's causing, as well as all of the unrest politically and economically. The US schools will always be working with folks who have homes in multiple spaces around the world. And how do our schools attend to that in terms of everything? The physical space, the curricular space, the relationships we build. We need to think differently. Our classrooms are not closed boxes. They're not isolated. And that's why it matters now as well.
I might just add one concern, is that one of the critiques of, I think, refugee education studies and critical refugee studies, and even some of the work that we've done, Julie, is that refugees are studied separately from others, right? And I think that is a real danger in that, but that it also is a possibility now. To study and to work with refugees with others, with other migrants. So in Arizona, there's many other border crossers, but there's also a host of other students and learners. And I think maybe to look more broadly at the ways in which, I don't want to say community can be built, coalition can be built. I mean, there's an example in Minneapolis recently where African refugees united with African Americans in a Black Lives Matter political social movement. And I think that's something that educational leaders could tap into in schools, right? We need not just look at refugees or English language learners or emergent bilinguals in isolation, right? We need to look more at the entire student population.
Absolutely. Thanks for adding that note, because yes, I mean, that's the idea of thinking across all of these sort of divides, and what's really interesting though, is that as educational leaders, we're well aware of the categories that matter in terms of testing and funding, right? So we know that the census categories are significant in terms of reporting on student progress and school progress within district and state formulas. And we know that reporting on ELs is important, right? And then sometimes people become buried in those census categories or become invisible or silenced within certain parameters and domains. So certainly thinking across all of those is a really, really important part of the work, and something that is so, you use the phrase coalition building, is so important in terms of thinking of what are the coalitions and what are the ways that we can work better together to meet the needs of the students, all of the students in our classrooms, across these sort of identity categories, which are really themselves very fluid and imprecise. And at the same time, when we talk about culturally responsive and sustaining pedagogies, that means really looking at the particulars as well, right? And making sure that we're attending to the particulars of the home languages and the particulars of different cultural practices and the particulars of different music engagements and other popular culture engagements. And so not setting up an either or, but really this situation in which we're attending to all of these things simultaneously is really important.
Thank you for that robust answer and for talking about not only the critique of your work, but also the importance of acknowledging the lived experience and intersecting identities of your students and families. So that brings us to our final question. Is there anything else you'd like to add to this conversation?
I think I would just like to add that it would be great for leaders to be bold right now, for education leaders to be bold and to engage actively in conversations and in the critiques of their conversations and their practices and their policies. This is not a moment to shy away from that which is really challenging and really complex and really underfunded and all of these things, but rather to really, as they say, lean into it and, embrace that this is the work of public schools, and how do you want to be in that work, and who do you want to be in that work with?
Yeah, I would agree to, with all of that, Julie. I also would say that I see education leaders defined very broadly as policymakers, and the policy through practice. And so there, I think I'm hopeful that education leaders are going to push policy, challenge policy, tweak policy. While the policies will be there, I do think there's potential, especially at the school and district levels, to morph that into something else. And as long as they have the most marginalized in mind when they're doing those things, and humanity in mind, and the well-being of everyone in schools, teachers, parents, refugee students, I just continue to be hopeful, knowing that it's a really difficult job. Yeah.
Well, on that note, that concludes the conversation, spring 2022 version. Thank you, Julie, and thank you, Jill, for passing your knowledge on to us and sharing the resources that are included on this newsletter as well. So good luck to you, Julie. Good luck with your dissertation. And we look forward to your continued work in Arizona and beyond.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay. Thanks, Jill.
See you in San Diego at AERA.
See you there.